I don't clearly remember how I collapsed onto the hospital floor. All I know is that when I opened my eyes, I saw a deep crimson pool spreading from my own body. My stomach twisted, not from labor, but from a sharp, urgent, wild pain, like something was clawing its way out from inside. The alarm blared from the stark white ceiling. A doctor shouted, "Code Red!" just before the gurney rolled, speeding me through the cold hallways. Everything happened so fast, I couldn't tell what was flashing light and what was a swirl of tangled memories in my head. I wanted to clutch my belly, to scream out my daughter's name, the baby who hadn't yet been born. But I was powerless. My lips moved in the air, but no sound came out. And then I saw him, Marcus, my husband, the man who once swore he would protect me with his life. He stood there, just a few steps away, but he didn't move, didn't rush toward me, didn't call for help, didn't say a word. He just stood there, silent. The way he looked at me, it wasn't worry, it wasn't fear. It was something cold and foreign enough to make my skin crawl. Standing beside Marcus was Brianna, the new medical coordinator, and I knew then I hadn't imagined that kick. It was real. It brought me down, because I walked in at the exact moment, too exact. But what they didn't know, I would survive. And from that moment on, I was no longer the victim. I was the one who lived, and I would make sure every single one of them paid for it. My name is Elena Morales, 32 years old, a PhD candidate in psychology, specializing in trauma behavior and emotional recovery after loss. I used to believe I could analyze any form of dysfunctional behavior, read even the smallest signals in a relationship, and because of that, I would never be deceived. I was wrong. Marcus, my husband, is a cardiologist, 6 years older than me. He's the kind of man who makes people look up when he walks into a room. Tall, composed, and he speaks as if he's diagnosing people's emotions with his whole heart. We met at a medical conference in Chicago. At the time, I was presenting my research on the psychological effects of serious medical events. Marcus was the one who asked the final question, sharp, but never condescending. I remember he smiled and said, "I fix hearts with a scalpel. You fix them with empathy." I fell in love that very moment. 3 years later, we got married. A small ceremony on the Oregon coast, with only close family and friends. I didn't need anything grand. I needed peace, and I thought I had found it. We had gone through 2 miscarriages. Each time, it felt like I was falling into a bottomless pit no one could pull me out of. But Marcus was always there, gentle, thoughtful, never placing blame. "We'll try again," he said when I had no tears left to cry. "Until the baby is ready to stay." The 3rd pregnancy felt like a miracle. I was careful with every step. Marcus took care of me like I was the very heart that needed the most protection. I believed that after everything, I had found the man who would never hurt me. I believed I was the lucky wife. But that belief, as it turned out, was the very first thing to fall apart. I used to think that after all those losses, I wouldn't have the courage to dream of something whole again. But then, when the baby stayed, I began to allow myself to hope. After 3 anxious months, my pregnancy gradually stabilized. For the first time, I let out a quiet sigh of relief when the ultrasound doctor said all the numbers looked normal. The baby's heartbeat pulsed like a little drum inside me, steady and strong. I cried in the car while listening to that recording on loop. This time, maybe the baby truly wanted to stay with me. Marcus suggested I take a full break from work to focus entirely on the pregnancy. "I want you to really rest," he said, handing me a warm cup of tea with peppermint and a hint of ginger. "I'll take care of everything." I hesitated. I loved my job, but then I saw the resolve in his eyes, not forceful, but protective, and I thought maybe I should allow myself to be soft, just this once. From that moment on, my days felt like a peaceful painting. Marcus brewed tea for me in the mornings, gently massaged my swollen feet in the evenings, and read prenatal books to me in his warm, low voice as the sky darkened. We chose the paint color for the baby's room together, a soft jade green, light as clouds. He bought a rocking chair so I could sit and read, or simply listen to the gentle kicks inside my belly. Each week, Marcus marked the calendar with tiny symbols, hearts, stars, and smiley faces. "The closer we get, the more I love this baby," he said, placing his hand on my belly. "And I love you more than ever." I felt like I was living in a world woven from tenderness. I began to believe that the pain I'd endured before was the price for this gift. A real home, a true family. Friends called me a lucky woman. Even my mother said, "Marcus is a rare one, sweetheart. Hold on to him." And I did hold on. I loved him. I gave him every part of my trust, holding nothing back. I had no idea that the place I thought was the safest would become the very source of all the pain to come. I used to believe that if something was wrong in life, my instincts would be the first to warn me. But it turns out, sometimes those warnings come in forms so small that we don't recognize them until it's already too late. I started feeling nauseous every time I drank my morning tea. The same tea Marcus always made for me. He said it was all natural herbs, good for pregnancy, sleep, and blood pressure. At first, it was just a slight irritation in my throat, then a jittery feeling in my stomach. But after a few days, it became real nausea. I tried skipping it one morning, didn't drink it, didn't say anything. Strangely, that day, I felt much better. I'm not the suspicious type, but when something repeats often enough, instinct speaks. I asked Marcus about the ingredients in the tea. He looked at me and chuckled. "Another worry, huh?" he said gently. "Just peppermint, a bit of licorice, some Asian herbs. My mom sent it over when you first got pregnant, remember?" I stayed silent, but part of me started to feel unsettled. That feeling didn't go away, even when I tried to push it aside. I tried reading the labels on the tea packs when Marcus wasn't home, but there was nothing specific, just vague names, tranquility blend, natural herbal relief, mother's grace. No dosages, no clear formulas. One afternoon, I opened my laptop to look things up, but as soon as I typed a few words, I felt ridiculous. I was the wife of a cardiologist, highly educated, working at a prestigious hospital, and here I was, sitting there, doubting a cup of tea he had made for me himself. I scolded myself. I thought I was just overly anxious because of the previous miscarriages, that maybe my body was reacting differently, or maybe I was just stressed. So I didn't ask again, didn't check again, and I drank it. That cup of tea was still warm, still carried the gentle scent, like the morning hug he always gave me. But deep down, a tiny seed of doubt had quietly begun to sprout. No one saw it, no one heard it, but it was there. And later, I would come to realize, from that seemingly harmless cup of tea, all the horrors had begun. I didn't think that bout of nausea would end up changing my entire day, but that morning, I couldn't bring myself to swallow the porridge Marcus had left. The dizziness lingered all the way into noon, and then I felt a chill down my spine when I touched the cup of tea still sitting on the table. I decided to go outside for some air. On the way, for some reason, I stopped by the familiar sandwich shop on the corner, the place where Marcus and I used to eat during our early dates. At the time, I simply thought I wanted to do something kind. A grilled chicken sandwich, no sauce, his favorite, and a bottle of pomegranate juice. Because my husband's working so hard, I told myself, smiling at the thought of surprising him. I didn't call ahead. I wanted it to be a surprise. The cardiology department was on the 6th floor, and there was a side hallway that led to the staff break room, rarely used. I had been there a few times and still had the temporary badge I was issued during my research at the hospital. I pushed the door open, and in a single second, my world shattered. Marcus was standing close to a woman, her arms around his neck, blonde hair tied high, white lab coat disheveled. She was laughing, whispering something into his ear, and then they kissed. Not rushed, not hidden. That kiss wasn't a mistake. It was familiar, natural, and full of passion. I froze in place, like someone had yanked me backward out of my own life. The sandwich box dropped to the floor. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't shout. I simply turned away and began to walk. But I should have walked faster. I shouldn't have stopped, because in the very next moment, a voice rang out behind me, cold and full of mockery. "Oh, so that's the wife?" I should have walked away. I should have left the moment I saw that kiss. But her words hooked into me like a sharp barb, pulling me back. "Oh, so that's the wife?" I turned around, slowly. Brianna, the new medical coordinator. I remembered her. I had seen her in passing once at a hospital party. Back then, she smiled brightly as she shook my hand, but her eyes were ice cold. Now, that look was clearer than ever. She stood between Marcus and me, as if deliberately claiming the space that used to be mine. "You look surprised. I thought he told you," Brianna said, adjusting the collar of her blouse she had just hastily pulled up. "Or, do you still believe you're the only one?" I stood frozen. Marcus said nothing. He just looked at me, with eyes that held not a shred of remorse. "I know you're pregnant," Brianna continued, her tone flat, like she was reading out blood pressure numbers. "But who's to say the baby's even his, right?" I was stunned. In that moment, my stomach clenched, not because of the baby, but from a humiliation I had never known in my life. "I've met plenty of women like you," she went on, "the kind who won't let go. The kind who think keeping a baby is enough to tie down a man." Then she smiled, a crooked smile, sharp as a razor. "But here's the thing. Clinging doesn't mean being loved. Sometimes it just makes you annoying." I turned to Marcus, hoping for a denial, a protective glance, just a little something, some trace of the man who once vowed to love me forever, but all I got was silence. Then came a single sentence, dry and cold as ice. "Elena, this doesn't need to become a thing." I laughed, a broken laugh, no longer forced. Big or small, this wasn't mine to decide, but from that moment on, every line had been crossed. I don't remember how I turned and walked away. I just remember my whole body trembling, with rage, with humiliation, with a chilling numbness that spread from the back of my neck down my spine, as if my own flesh no longer belonged to me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just wanted to leave that place as fast as possible, as if the air there had already decayed. I had only taken a few steps when I heard the clack of heels behind me. "Elena!" Brianna called. "I'm not finished talking." I didn't turn around, but the footsteps grew closer. Then she stepped ahead, blocking my path. "Don't play the victim," she said, her eyes sharp and cold. "You think just because you're pregnant, people have to make way for you? The world doesn't revolve around you." "Move," I said, my voice hoarse, but she didn't move. "You have no right to say anything else to me," I continued, this time emphasizing every word. "I'm going to report this. You, Marcus, all of it." Brianna's face suddenly changed. The smirk, the superior look, they were gone. What replaced them was something darker. She took one step forward, then suddenly shoved me hard with both hands. I stumbled backward, still off balance, when a sudden force, violent, deliberate, and ice cold, struck me straight in the stomach. A real kick, not a shove, not an accidental bump. A kick with intent aimed at the one place on my body that couldn't defend itself. I fell. My whole body slammed against the cold tile floor. Pain surged from my abdomen like a tidal wave. I tried to curl up, holding my stomach, but a hot, wet sensation between my legs froze me in place. Blood. I knew exactly what it was. The loud noise caused the door of the room next to us to burst open. A man stepped out, Dr. Vargas, the hospital director. "Call emergency! Code red!" he shouted, kneeling down beside me. My vision blurred. My ears rang. I heard yelling, running footsteps, the screeching of alarms overhead. I couldn't hear clearly anymore. All I could see were the lights rushing past like a river of brightness. And in that hazy moment, I wondered, was my baby girl still there? Or had I lost her again? I will never forget that moment. The moment I opened my eyes in the dim light of the recovery room, with no sense of time left, only a hollow, aching emptiness spreading through my body. I reached for my belly. Nothing. No movement. No familiar little kicks. I whispered, like a prayer, "Please, is my baby still here?" A young nurse leaned over my bed, her eyes gentle but strained. "She was born," she said, whispering like the truth might break if spoken too loud. "Week 33. We're doing everything we can." I nodded. I couldn't cry. I couldn't say anything else. Her name was Lila. She weighed barely 4 pounds, tiny, skin thin as dried petals, lying in the incubator surrounded by wires, tubes, and sensors wrapped around her fragile body. I watched her through the glass, my hand resting on the cold plastic shell. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't protect you." I stayed in the hospital for 6 more days. Not because I needed to stay, but because Lila needed time. To breathe, to feed, to live. Marcus showed up briefly on the 2nd day. "I had surgery," he said, avoiding my eyes. "Emergency cases. I couldn't step away." I nodded. I had trained myself to believe that saving lives was something that couldn't wait. But this time, as I watched him rush out without even glancing at the NICU, something unfamiliar stirred in my chest. It wasn't pain. It wasn't anger. It was doubt. I began to connect the dots. The nausea after the tea, the dismissive words, his silence when I was humiliated, and his eyes on the day I lay in a pool of blood while he stood there, doing nothing. Something wasn't right, and this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. Once doubt had taken root in my mind, I began to see everything through a different lens, and what I saw only made my already fractured trust fall completely apart. The first day I was strong enough to get out of bed, I asked Marcus about filing an official report on the assault. It wasn't just a legal right, it was the only way to protect me and our daughter from the person who had deliberately tried to destroy us. He looked at me and sighed, as if I had asked for something completely unreasonable. "You're exhausted, Elena. It's best not to make this a big deal. We should focus on the baby's recovery." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I repeated myself slowly, reminding him that I had been kicked in the stomach, inside the very hospital where he worked. This wasn't a petty personal issue. It was a crime. But Marcus just shook his head. He said that filing a report would draw attention, damage the hospital's reputation, affect his career, and disrupt our life going forward. "Trust me, Elena. Sometimes staying silent is the best thing to do." Silence. I had never known silence to be so terrifying. A few days later, I took the initiative to visit the hospital's legal department myself. The responses I got were polite smiles, hollow reassurances. They advised me to think about the collective image, said that making the incident public could lead to scandal and harm hundreds of innocent staff members. One nurse whispered as she passed me in the hallway, "Sometimes, things like this get handled internally much faster." I shivered. I asked about Brianna, but strangely, after that day, she had vanished from the hospital, as if she had never existed. Her name was gone from the shift schedule. No one admitted to having worked with her. Her personnel file was completely empty. I went from office to office, but all I received were head shakes and evasive glances. That silence, that disappearance, and Marcus's cold detachment, they all felt like an invisible hand tightening around me. I felt completely isolated, as if the entire world had silently agreed that my truth wasn't worth acknowledging. And it was in that moment I understood. If I didn't find the answers myself, no one else ever would. When I realized no one was on my side, I began searching for clues on my own. And ironically, the first clue appeared right inside the place I still called home. One evening, while Lila was sleeping in the incubator at the hospital, I stopped by the house to pick up some clothes. Marcus had left his iPad on the kitchen counter, the screen still lit, with his email inbox open. I hesitated for a few seconds. I wasn't the kind of woman who snoops through her husband's emails. But then the image of blood spreading across the hospital floor flashed in my mind, and I knew I could no longer blindly trust like before. I touched the screen. The words appeared clearly. It was a confirmation email for a life insurance policy. Insured, Elena Morales. Beneficiary, Marcus Morales. Amount, $2 million. I read it over and over, my heart pounding. What stunned me wasn't just the number. It was the date the policy was signed, exactly 3 weeks after I became pregnant. I tried to convince myself that maybe this was just preparation, that Marcus wanted to protect the family in case something unfortunate happened. But those reassurances quickly collapsed under the growing fear tightening in my chest. I brought a printed copy of the policy to a lawyer I knew. After reading it, he looked at me with a faint trace of concern in his eyes. "He could absolutely purchase this kind of policy without your consent. Legally, there's nothing wrong, but..." He paused, flipping the page back. "The timing of the contract? is definitely questionable. I sat in silence, my hands ice cold. A flurry of questions echoed in my head. Why did Marcus rush to buy insurance the moment I got pregnant? Why was the amount so large? And most of all, why did he hide it from me? That night, I returned to the hospital and sat alone beside my daughter's incubator. Looking at tiny, fragile Lila surrounded by tangled wires and tubes, I felt a new kind of dread rising inside me. This time, it wasn't fear of losing the baby. It was fear that the man I once called my husband might be planning something far more terrifying than betrayal. I didn't dare tell anyone, but from that moment on, I knew I could no longer see Marcus as the shoulder to lean on. He had become the most dangerous unknown in my life. After discovering the life insurance policy, I could no longer see any of Marcus's gestures the same way. Every cup of tea, every meal he prepared, every word he said for me and the baby felt like a sharp thorn pricking at my thoughts. And then I decided I had to do something, even if only to prove I was overthinking. I secretly kept a small amount of tea from the box Marcus used every day. When he left for work, I carefully wrapped it up and took it to a laboratory where an old friend of mine worked. She had studied the same field as me and now handled pharmaceutical analysis. I didn't dare tell her the real reason, only said I wanted to know the exact ingredients to make sure it was safe for the baby. She agreed to help, and 2 days later, when she called me, her voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. "Elena, there's something in that tea sample I don't think was there by accident." I froze. "Misoprostol," she said slowly, word by word. "It's a medication used to treat stomach ulcers, but it also causes strong uterine contractions. For pregnant women, even a small dose can lead to miscarriage or premature labor." I sat in silence, gripping the phone so tightly my hands trembled. My heart pounded, but my whole body felt like it had been plunged into ice water. This was no longer imagination, no longer vague suspicion. Marcus hadn't just betrayed me. He wanted me to lose the baby, and maybe lose my life. I remembered every time I drank the tea and threw up. The moment blood spread across the hospital floor. The cold look in his eyes as I writhed in pain. Suddenly, it all came together into a complete picture, and that picture took my breath away. I sat in the dark apartment, holding my belly as if trying to shield the last bit of warmth left for Lila. She was still breathing in that incubator, fragile as a thread, and I suddenly understood that her life, like mine, had never been more delicate. In the darkness, I made a vow to myself. If someone truly wanted to end my life and my daughter's, then I would do whatever it took to stop that from happening. Because from this moment on, trust was dead. All that remained was survival. After learning that the cup of tea could have killed me and my child, I could no longer look at Marcus with the eyes of a wife. I observed him as if he were a stranger, and every small detail became a potential piece of evidence. One evening, he came home late, hurriedly changed his shirt, and went straight into the bathroom. On the desk, his familiar black leather briefcase was left unattended, its clasp not fully secured. My heart pounded, torn between letting it go and uncovering the truth that might be hiding inside. I opened the case. Inside was a thick stack of documents, neatly bound with a green ribbon. The first page listed transactions with a medical equipment supplier. I skimmed through and noticed most items were labeled as refurbished, secondhand, yet the invoice listed them at full new prices. I flipped through the next pages. The figures caught in my throat. Over $3 million had been transferred in the span of 6 months. Recipient, Vincent Caruso. I had never heard that name, but its repeated appearance made it clear this wasn't a normal transaction. I took photos of each page with my phone, my hands shaking so badly that the images came out blurry. A terrifying thought echoed in my mind. Could it be that Marcus not only betrayed me, not only tried to harm me and our baby, but was also involved in some kind of financial crime? The water in the bathroom shut off, and I quickly stuffed the file back into the case and secured the clasp. I sank into the chair, trying to compose myself as Marcus walked out, wearing that same fake look of exhaustion. He looked at me and gave a half-hearted smile. "You okay?" I nodded, but inside I knew. That smile no longer hid anything. I had seen part of the truth, and from that moment on, I knew I would find even more. I tapped on the screen. The words appeared clearly. It was an email confirming a life insurance policy. Insured, Elena Morales. Beneficiary, Marcus Morales. Amount, $2 million. I read it again and again, my heart pounding wildly. What shocked me wasn't just the amount. It was the date the policy was signed, exactly 3 weeks after I became pregnant. I tried to reassure myself that maybe this was just preparation, a way for Marcus to protect our family in case something happened. But those reassurances crumbled beneath the growing dread swelling in my chest. I brought a printed copy of the policy to a lawyer I knew. After reading it, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a hint of concern. "He can absolutely take out this type of policy without your consent. Legally, there's nothing wrong, but..." He paused, flipping back a page. "The timing of it is definitely questionable." I sat in silence, my hands ice cold. Questions thundered in my mind. Why did Marcus rush to get life insurance right after I got pregnant? Why was the amount so large? And most importantly, why was all of it kept from me? That night, I returned to the hospital and sat alone beside my daughter's incubator. Looking at tiny, fragile Lila amid the tangled wires and tubes, I felt a new kind of dread rising. This time, it wasn't fear of losing the baby. It was the fear that the man I once called my husband was planning something even more horrifying than betrayal. I hadn't dared tell anyone, but from that moment on, I knew. I could no longer see Marcus as a shoulder to lean on. He had become the most dangerous unknown in my life. I couldn't sleep after seeing that name. Vincent Caruso. It pulsed through every heartbeat like a blot of ink slowly bleeding across a sheet of white paper. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I started with the internet. There weren't many Vincent Carusos, but just a few clicks pulled up a string of old articles. A businessman in private finance, a notorious loan shark in the Northeast. He had been involved in numerous lawsuits tied to manipulating healthcare institutions. One article from 2012 described him as a predator in the healthcare system, someone who targeted indebted doctors or hospital administrators, then used money and connections to turn them into puppets. Some lost their medical licenses, some vanished without a trace. All had one thing in common. They'd once been involved with Vincent. I read on, numb with disbelief. The transactions in Marcus's briefcase suddenly made chilling sense. Marcus wasn't just cheating in our marriage. He wasn't just trying to harm me and our baby. He was drowning in debt. And Vincent Caruso was the one holding his leash. One line from the article made my skin crawl. For many desperate physicians, the sudden death of a loved one is sometimes the final financial solution. I sat frozen in our empty room, my breath uneven. All at once, everything clicked into a horrifying picture. The life insurance policy, the morning tea, always prepared, that vacant look in Marcus's eyes as I lay in a pool of my own blood. None of it was random. If I died, or if the baby died, Marcus would collect $2 million in insurance. If that wasn't enough, he could cover the payments to Vincent under the guise of hospital expenses. To them, my death wasn't a tragedy. It was a financial solution. I bit my lip until it bled, trying not to scream, because I knew. From this moment on, I wasn't just a betrayed wife. I was prey, caught in a trap so carefully laid, it chilled me to the bone. And if I didn't find a way out soon, I would be the next name on Vincent Caruso's list. After discovering the connection between Marcus and Vincent Caruso, I couldn't bring myself to eat anything from the fridge. I couldn't sleep when Marcus was home. I locked the bedroom door, cradling Lila in my arms like she was the only shield that could keep me alive for one more night. I began documenting everything, bank transactions, emails, every suspicious move. But I still felt like I was fighting this war alone. until a strange phone call came in the middle of the night. A man's voice, deep and slightly hoarse, but unmistakably cautious and sincere. "This is Dr. Patel. I used to work there. You don't know me, but I know Marcus. And Brianna." My grip on the phone tightened. I'd heard that name before. Patel, an anesthesiologist who'd been suspended for allegedly stealing pain meds from the hospital's inventory. Rumors said he was an addict, but the voice on the other end didn't sound like someone trying to clear his name. "Brianna set me up." Back then, I discovered a forged internal prescription and was about to report it to the board, but then I was accused instead. He paused. "Shortly after, I lost my license." I asked why he was reaching out to me now. "Because I saw your name on an internal watch list, and because of Brianna. She's not just a care coordinator. She works for Vincent Caruso." My entire body went cold. "She's present in every hospital Vincent manipulates, always trying to get close to vulnerable staff, like Marcus. I don't know if Marcus is being threatened or if he's complicit, but if you're his wife, and if you were assaulted inside that hospital, then this isn't just personal anymore." I was speechless. "You need to protect yourself and your daughter," he said, "but don't act alone. If you have evidence, guard it, and find someone you can trust. The internal system is no longer safe." The call ended. I sat in the dark for a long time, his voice echoing in my ears. For the first time, I didn't feel utterly alone, but it was also the first time I realized I had stepped into a battle far bigger than myself. I once wished Marcus would turn back. I once secretly hoped, however faintly, that everything he did was only a moment of weakness, that deep down he still loved me, loved our child. But when the truth came to light, every old refuge became an abyss. And to win back my own life, I had to become someone else. I sat in the small apartment the hospital rented for mothers with children in incubators, holding my phone and typing each line slowly. "I want to talk. Not to blame, just for Lila. She needs both her parents." I read that message dozens of times before pressing send. Part of me felt sick at every word, but another part knew this was the only way to make him lower his guard. The message was read in less than a minute. Then Marcus replied, "I want to see you too. There's so much I didn't get to say. I miss you." The next morning, I handed the phone to Agent Mendoza. He nodded, carefully attaching a recording device inside my coat. "We'll be close by. All you need to do is stay calm and let him talk." I pressed my lips together and nodded. Inside my head, every emotion was buried under a perfect mask. The gentle smile, the softened gaze, the weary voice of a wife still in love. But beneath it, a storm was waiting to break. The meeting was set at a cafe near the park. Marcus arrived early, still in his white lab coat, his eyes carrying the look of someone for whom nothing had ever gone wrong. He stood up when he saw me walk in, as if everything between us were just a small crack, one that could be mended with a single conversation. But he didn't know. I was no longer the wife he thought he could control. I was the only one in that room who knew the real game had just begun. We sat facing each other in the slanted afternoon sunlight filtering through the cafe window near the park. I held a cup of mint tea in my hands, the steam fogging up the thin-rimmed glasses before my eyes, and I thought how ironic it was that it was still the same scent, except today, I was no longer drinking it from Marcus's hands. He looked at me for a long moment, then came that familiar smile, the kind that once made me feel loved, but now it only made me feel repulsed. "I miss you," Marcus began. "Really, I know things got out of control." I nodded, trying to keep my voice gentle. "I'm tired too. I don't want a war. Lila needs both of us." That sentence made him soften. I could clearly see the defenses fading from his eyes. "I didn't think things would go this far," he said, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup before him. "Back then, I just thought, if you didn't try to hold on to that baby, maybe everything would have been easier." My heart skipped a heavy beat. I tried to stay calm, tilting my head as if I hadn't understood. "What do you mean?" Marcus sighed. "I mean, back then you were so weak, so fragile. Everyone was worried. You know, I tried to make everything light. If you lost the child, we could have stopped sooner. We wouldn't have dragged the suffering this far." I stared at the man who had lain next to me every night for the past 3 years, and now sat here, using a gentle voice to describe a murder plot. "I didn't want to hurt you," he continued. "I just thought that if you realized everything, you'd see it was the reasonable choice." I didn't answer. I only smiled. A slight, tight smile, just enough to hide the trembling hand in my pocket, where the recording device the FBI had planted was waiting. In that moment, I was no longer the grieving wife trying to mend a marriage. I was a witness, a survivor, the one who had just heard a confession written in blood and who knew for certain his game was over. I left the cafe with slow, measured steps, as if it had only been an ordinary conversation between a husband and wife trying to mend what was broken. But deep in my heart, I knew each step was a cut, severing the final thread that still bound me to the man who had once been my whole world. Across the street, I caught a glimpse of a man stepping out of a car, wearing an earpiece, his eyes never turning toward me. Another figure brushed past behind Marcus as he left the cafe. No guns were drawn. No shouting, just an ending. Quiet, cold, and precise. The FBI had gathered everything they needed: the confessions, the documents I had collected, and the list of financial transactions Vincent Caruso used to manipulate the hospital system. Within 24 hours, Marcus was arrested in his office. Brianna was handcuffed in the underground parking lot as she tried to flee the city in a rental car. Vincent was taken at his suburban home, the place he believed had been bought with enough silence that no one would ever dare touch him. All three links in a carefully woven web of crime, were now cut away, dragged into the light. And I no longer had to hide behind any mask of gentleness. That night, I returned to the hospital. Lila was still in the incubator, her tiny hand curled like a flower about to bloom. I opened the door, carefully lifted her, and placed her against my chest. Her breathing was slow, gentle, but steady, like a lullaby continuing after the climax had faded. I sat there for hours, unmoving, letting time slip quietly by. And for the first time since the day I found out I was pregnant, I felt safe. Not because I was protected, but because I had protected myself. The courtroom that day was packed. Reporters, former colleagues, eyes filled with both curiosity and outrage. All of them fixed on the 3 people sitting in the defendants' chairs: Marcus, Brianna, and Vincent Caruso. I sat in the second row. No disguise, no attempt to hide. I wore a simple black dress, my hand clenched around the tiny hospital bracelet a nurse had fastened on Lila the day she was born. A reminder that I had nearly lost everything. Marcus wore a gray suit, his face more gaunt than I remembered, but his eyes were the same, smooth, unnervingly calm. I couldn't tell what he thought when he saw me. Maybe he expected me to break down. Maybe he still believed himself innocent. But I was here, steady. Brianna never lifted her head. The hair she once styled so carefully was now tied back hastily, her forehead marked with the lines of age she had once believed makeup and power could conceal. Gone was her defiant allure. What remained was only an empty shell, waiting for judgment. Vincent, draped in a silk suit, entered with the polish of a seasoned investor. But the atmosphere in the room diminished him. For the first time in decades, he looked like a man who could not buy his way out. The prosecutor laid out each piece of evidence: the recorded conversation, the insurance contracts, the email exchanges, the financial records. And then came my testimony. No trembling, no tears, just the truth. Bare, cold. When the judge read the verdict, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Morales, 35 years in prison with no parole for the first 28. Convictions: conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, money laundering, and violations of medical ethics. Brianna Keller, 18 years for assaulting a pregnant woman and aiding and concealing a criminal act. Vincent Caruso, 12 years, sentence reduced for cooperating with investigators and providing evidence to prosecute the hospital money laundering ring. I felt no joy, no triumph, only exhaustion. It was like reaching the final page of a book and still sitting there, breathless, not knowing what to do next. Marcus left the courtroom flanked by 2 officers. He didn't look back, but I saw him clearly. Not the man who had once cared for me, but the one who had crossed the line from hurt into crime. I was no longer angry, no longer in love. I had simply learned how to let go of a hand that once meant everything. The woman who had once waited for her husband each night with fragile hope. She was gone. The one sitting here was someone else, a survivor, a mother, a witness who had dared to speak what no one else would. That night, I went home and held Lila in my arms. She slept peacefully, her tiny hand clutching my shirt with the purest instinct to survive. And for the first time in months, I no longer dreamed of blood. It took me more than 6 months to grow accustomed to a life no longer shadowed by danger lurking behind the door. Each morning, I woke without scanning the room for locks. I relearned how to drink tea without checking the ingredients first. And I relearned how to breathe, deep, slow, unhurried. During that time, I also returned to something I had once abandoned, my doctoral dissertation. That dissertation had once been my dream. Before everything collapsed, I had planned to write about grief behaviors and the psychological responses of nurses in medical environments. But after all that had happened, I chose a different subject, more personal, more painful, and truer than any research I had ever attempted. Rebuilding the self after betrayal and violence, a psychological journey through trauma. I didn't write it from theory. I wrote it from flesh, blood, and breath. Each page carried sleepless nights. Each citation echoed with silent cries in the ICU. The defense committee gave me a perfect score. One of them, a renowned professor of psychology, stood after the session and said, "You did more than survive. You turned ruin into a lantern for others." I was invited to serve as an adjunct professor at a medical university, and at the same time, the very hospital where Marcus once worked extended its own invitation. Not as a doctor's wife, not as an employee, but as the lead instructor of a new program for supporting victims and staff in the aftermath of trauma. The first time I walked through the hospital gates after all those months, I thought my heart would pound with old terror. But it didn't. I entered with a different feeling, steady, clear, and necessary. In my first class, I looked at the women sitting silently before me, nurses who had endured humiliation, interns exploited by power, young mothers who had just escaped toxic relationships. I didn't tell them I understood everything. I only shared a piece of my story. That once, I too had believed I would never step beyond my own pain. And then I looked at them and smiled. "Pain doesn't make you weaker," I told them. "It makes you deeper, deep enough to know where you must stand and why." Lila turned 3 on a bright spring morning. She ran across the backyard, hair flying wild, clutching a paper airplane I had folded from an old calendar page. No one would have believed she was once a premature baby, born at 33 weeks, weighing barely 4 pounds, dependent on machines just to breathe for nearly her first month of life. Now, Lila was curious, sharp, and full of the kinds of questions that stop adults in their tracks. "Mom, why don't you have a wedding picture with Dad?" I no longer flinched when I heard that. I sat down, pulled her onto my lap, and gently stroked her back. "Because some people come into our lives to teach us lessons," I told her, "not to walk beside us forever." She didn't press further. She just nodded thoughtfully, then ran off again, as if she had absorbed something profound without needing the words spelled out. I never speak ill of her father. I don't paint monsters in her mind, but I teach her how to tell the difference between love and control, between sacrifice and manipulation disguised as, "I did it for you." I teach her about courage, not the absence of fear, but the choice to look fear in the eye and keep walking. I teach her about forgiveness, not as a pardon for others, but as a release for herself, so she'll never be chained to resentment. But there is one thing I will never teach her: endurance for the sake of endurance. I want her to know that if one day someone makes her feel small, makes her doubt her own instincts, robs her of sleep, of voice, of light in her eyes, she has every right to walk away. No permission needed, no justification required. Lila is not only the child I brought into the world. She is proof that life can take root even in the ashes of what once seemed ruined beyond repair. And every time I watch her sleep, I whisper a quiet message to her future. I cannot shield you from every wound, but I will give you wings, so you'll know that even if you fall, you can always rise and fly again. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to speak about what I had lived through. Part of it was fear of pity. Part of it was the conviction that I would never be strong enough to retell everything. But then a friend who worked in community psychology said to me, "Silence only feeds the wound. Sharing, even if your voice shakes, can save someone else who's on the verge of breaking." The first time I appeared on a talk show, my hands trembled. But when the lights came on and the host asked, "Elena, what kept you from giving up?" I didn't have to think. "Lila," I said, "and the truth." From that show onward, the invitations began to arrive. Conferences on trauma, podcasts, classes on domestic violence prevention, support groups for survivors. I didn't speak with bitterness. I spoke with lived experience, with data, with a love that had been broken but also healed. After some time, I received funding to create my own program. From Survivor to Warrior, a podcast series sharing true stories of people who once believed they had fallen beyond recovery. Each episode was a small flame in the dark, and with every story, I realized I was no longer alone. I was just one among thousands who had hit bottom, yet still found a way to climb back, even with scraped hands and trembling legs. I wasn't a hero. I was proof. Proof that pain is not the end. It's just a milestone on the path of living, if we're brave enough to keep moving. In the very first episode, I spoke words that weren't meant to impress anyone. They were my own final vow, meant for myself, for Lila, and for anyone listening in silence. They wanted me to fall. I did fall, but I rose, and I ran. Not for them, but for me, and for my daughter.